A black man is slapped without cause by a bigoted white woman. He slaps her back, shocking her. Michael Jennings drove into the grocery store parking lot, scanning the rows for the few open spaces available. The sunny Saturday afternoon had brought in a crowd with cars darting around as shoppers hurried to finish their errands. Driving down the lane, he noticed a free parking spot conveniently close to the store entrance. It was a prime location, especially on a day as busy as this. He carefully maneuvered his car into the spot, ensuring it was parked perfectly between the lines. As he opened his car door to get out, the sharp sound of screeching tires caught his attention. He glanced up to see a white SUV arriving in a way that could only be described as aggressive. Inside the SUV sat a woman, her face already contorted with anger before she even rolled the window down. "Hey!" she yelled, pointing an accusing finger directly at him. "That parking spot was mine." Michael blinked in surprise, taken aback by the abrupt hostility in her tone. "Excuse me?" he replied, his voice calm yet laced with confusion. The woman had already opened her door halfway and slammed it shut as she got out. She marched straight toward him, her voice carrying loudly without a hint of restraint. "I had been waiting for that spot," she snapped, stepping uncomfortably close to him. "My blinker was on, clear for everyone to see." Michael looked around, taking in his surroundings. He hadn't seen any vehicles lingering near the spot earlier, and the lane had been completely clear. Speaking evenly, he said, "I didn't notice you." The spot looked empty when I arrived. Her eyes narrowed sharply as she folded her arms, glaring at him as if he had personally wronged her. "Of course you didn't notice me. You people never do, right?" she shot back. Michael's jaw clenched tightly in response. He could already see exactly where this conversation was headed. This wasn't unfamiliar. He'd witnessed countless minor inconveniences turn into racial confrontations before. Taking a deep breath, he resolved not to let her words provoke him. "Listen, I'm sorry if you were waiting for it, but the spot was open. I didn't cut anyone off." "Don't you dare talk to me like that," she barked, her voice escalating with every syllable. "I'm sick of you people thinking you can just do whatever you please. Every one of you is the same, entitled, rude, and acting like the rules don't even matter to you." Michael's hands curled into fists as he fought to maintain his composure. "Ma'am, I'm here to get my groceries. I'm not looking for trouble. It's just a parking space." Her expression twisted with anger at his measured response, as though it made her even more upset. She moved another step toward him, jabbing a finger directly at his chest. "Trouble? You want to bring up trouble? People like you are nothing but a problem. You show up in neighborhoods like this and just ruin everything. I'm willing to bet you don't even live anywhere near here, do you?" A flash of anger surged through Michael, but his tone stayed steady. "Where I live has absolutely nothing to do with what's happening here." "Of course it matters," she yelled, her body almost shaking from her fury. "This is exactly what happens when they let people like you move into our areas. You think you can just take whatever you feel like? I've had enough of your kind." Her words hit hard, but Michael was determined not to let her see him react. He looked around and noticed a few people nearby, quietly observing the escalating scene. He realized he had to stop this situation before it spiraled further out of control. "I'm not going to engage with this," he said as he turned and started walking toward the store. "You're angry about a parking spot, but it's not worth all of this." Just as he began to walk away, she surged forward and shoved him forcefully from behind. Michael staggered, barely managing to regain his balance before hitting the ground. His pulse quickened as he turned sharply to confront her. "What's your problem?" he demanded, his patience finally beginning to fray. "You have no right to lay your hands on me." Karen, the name he had already assigned her in his mind, remained firm, her chest rising and falling with anger. "Oh, I'll do whatever I please. Do you think you can just walk away? I'm not finished with you." Michael took a step back, working to maintain his self-control. His thoughts raced wildly, imagining all the possible ways this could escalate. He knew if this situation went any further, it would not turn out in his favor. He had witnessed far too many instances where a black man defending himself was suddenly cast as the aggressor in everyone's eyes. "Lady, just walk away before you end up doing something you'll regret." he cautioned. She sneered at him, her upper lip curling in disdain. "You don't get to tell me what to do, boy." The word lingered in the tense silence between them, weighted with its unmistakable racist undertone. Michael's breath hitched, and his fists tightened so hard that his nails pressed into his skin. This had escalated far beyond a dispute over a parking spot. It was now about power, privilege, and her blatant belief that she could act without ever facing the consequences. He felt the strong urge to walk away, but the sting of her words, the shove, everything, boiled under his skin. Then, without any warning at all, she struck out. Her hand flew through the air, quick and deliberate, landing on Michael's face with a slap so loud it reverberated against the surrounding cars. The blow caused his head to snap to the side, the sting spreading sharply across his cheek and jawline. His face burned, not just from the physical sting of the slap, but from the deep humiliation of her making a spectacle out of him. Michael froze momentarily, stunned as his thoughts raced to comprehend what had just occurred. The slap had not been merely physical. It was a bold declaration, a signal that she thought she could hit him and demean him without ever fearing any consequences. His body tensed, every instinct urging him to respond. He understood what he needed to do, what he was supposed to do, but the blaze of anger within him refused to be extinguished. He couldn't stand there and simply accept this. Acting on impulse, he lifted his hand and slapped her in return, not with the same intensity, but firmly enough to make his point. The slap was deliberate yet restrained, a measured warning rather than an act of revenge. Karen stumbled backward, her hand instinctively going to her cheek, her face a mix of disbelief and shock. Her eyes grew wide with surprise, and for a brief moment, everything fell silent. Then, suddenly, she erupted. You hit me!" she shrieked, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "You animal! You'll pay for what you've done." "Do you even know who I am?" she demanded. "You think you can touch me? I'll destroy your life." Her words tumbled out in quick succession, each one escalating in volume and desperation. She flailed her arms erratically, resembling a child mid-tantrum, her face flushing an unflattering shade of red. She scanned her surroundings, desperately seeking validation from the crowd of bystanders now watching the escalating scene. "He assaulted me!" she screeched, her finger trembling as she pointed accusingly at Michael. "He hit me! This thug thinks he can lay his hands on a woman? You're finished!" Michael's heart pounded as the attention of the crowd intensified. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others began recording the scene on their phones. He could sense their eyes fixed on him, their silent judgment solidifying with every passing second. He had experienced this before. The swift shift in perception, the ease with which he could be turned into the villain of a narrative he didn't start. He stepped back slightly, attempting to diffuse the escalating tension with a measured calm. "You hit me first. I wasn't looking for any trouble." Karen, her hand still pressed against her cheek, hissed at him like an injured predator. "I'm not engaging in this with you," Michael stated, his tone cool and unwavering. "I'm done here." Not giving her a chance to reply, he turned and strode away, his heart still pounding, the sting on his cheek still sharp. Behind him, Karen kept shouting, her words dissolving into incoherent shrieks as her fury overtook her. "You're done! Do you hear me? You're finished!" Michael didn't spare her a backward glance. He entered the store, the automatic doors sliding shut behind him with a sense of finality. Yet, her voice lingered in his ears, sharp and relentless, as if it were etched permanently in his mind. Inside the grocery store, the calm atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the storm of chaos Michael had just escaped. The soft hum of the air conditioning and the quiet murmur of shoppers provided an almost surreal sense of normalcy after the heated clash in the parking lot. He gripped the shopping cart's handle tightly, his knuckles turning white as he worked to calm the rapid thudding of his heart. As he navigated the aisles, his mind replayed the confrontation over and over, each word and action repeating like an endless film reel. The sting from Karen's slap lingered on his cheek, but it was the weight of her words that bore down on him even more heavily. "Boy," The word echoed in his mind, dripping with venom and disdain. No matter how often he encountered moments like this, the sheer ugliness of such encounters always struck him deeply. He knew he should have walked away sooner, yet it always seemed to play out the same way. People like Karen carried this belief that they could say and do whatever they pleased, convinced they'd face no consequences because of who they were, and because of who he was. It was utterly draining, this endless balancing act of deciding whether to let things slide or defend himself, fully aware that in the end, it might not make a difference. He could already envision how people would perceive the whole incident. How would the police respond if they were involved? Michael gave his head a small shake, forcing himself to concentrate on the task at hand. He'd come to the store for groceries, nothing more. Bread, milk, eggs, just the basic necessities. However, as he extended his hand toward a loaf of bread, he paused. His thoughts were elsewhere. His mind lingered in the parking lot, replaying the sting of Karen's slap and the venom of her insults. The onlookers outside had seen it all, a black man caught in an argument with a white woman. He could still feel their gazes, the barely perceptible shift in their expressions when she screamed and accused him of hitting her, despite her being the one who struck first. He had barely grazed her in comparison to the force she had unleashed on him. Yet none of that mattered. It never did. He dropped the bread into his cart and continued, attempting to focus on the next item. But as he moved through the store, a deeper, colder anger began to take root. It wasn't the hot, impulsive anger that had ignited during their altercation. This anger ran deeper, felt colder, and was far more familiar to him. It was the same anger that rose each time someone looked at him as if he didn't belong, each time he was judged solely by the color of his skin rather than his actions. This wasn't simply about a parking spot or a slap. It was about the way she had behaved from the very beginning, treating him as though he was beneath her, as though he didn't deserve to share the same space. Her words had struck him just as powerfully as her hand had, long before she ever laid a finger on him. Michael turned the corner into another aisle, grabbed a carton of milk, and tossed it into his cart with a bit more force than needed. He inhaled deeply, attempting to steady himself. This wasn't his first encounter with this kind of confrontation, and he knew it wouldn't be his last. Yet today, for reasons he couldn't quite pinpoint, it felt heavier, like it had burrowed deeper beneath his skin than usual. He had attempted to do the right thing, had tried to walk away, but the shove and the slap lingered in his mind. It felt as though she had crossed a line he simply couldn't overlook. The memory of slapping her back gnawed at him, not from guilt, but from the knowledge that she would weaponize it against him. He hadn't struck her in anger. It was a reflex, a measured reaction. But she would twist it, yell even louder, play the victim, because she knew exactly how to manipulate the situation. As Michael continued filling his cart, he couldn't help but wonder how things would have unfolded if their roles were reversed. If he had been the one to instigate the argument, if he had delivered the first slap, would anyone have sided with him? Would the onlookers have remained silent and observant in the same way? Lost in his thoughts, he eventually found himself at the checkout line. The cashier offered him a polite smile, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him. Michael managed a slight nod, attempting to ground himself in the present moment. He swiped his card, collected his bags, and made his way toward the exit. Yet as soon as he stepped outside, a knot of anxiety formed in his stomach. He dreaded the idea of returning to his car. The thought of what he might encounter, whether Karen was still lingering or had escalated things further, filled him with unease. He couldn't rid himself of the nagging suspicion that she hadn't finished. She didn't strike him as someone who would back down without making a scene. As Michael neared the parking lot, he caught sight of his car in the distance. His heart dropped. Even from afar, he could tell something was amiss. His pace quickened, and with each step closer, the extent of the damage came into sharper focus. Long, jagged scratches covered the side of his car, as though someone had dragged a key across the paint, stripping away chunks of its glossy finish. Michael froze, his eyes locked on the damage as disbelief and anger surged through him. His fists clenched tightly at his sides. Karen. It had to be her doing. This wasn't some random act of vandalism. This was intentional, personal. Michael approached his car, his hand tracing the deep grooves etched into the paint. The scratches were new and glaringly fresh. She must have done this while he was inside, likely laughing to herself the entire time, convinced she had triumphed. He could practically hear her mocking tone echoing in his mind, jeering, condescending, spewing venom as though she were untouchable. A fresh wave of anger surged within him, more potent than before. His chest constricted as his eyes swept over the damage. The calm, introspective mood he'd tried to hold on to had evaporated. This had gone far beyond mere words now. She had crossed into actions that were real, damaging, and would cost him both time and money to fix. His eyes scanned the parking lot, half expecting to spot her smirking triumphantly from a distance, but she was nowhere to be seen. For a fleeting moment, he considered calling the police, but found himself hesitating. He was well aware of how situations like this often unfolded. She would twist the narrative, play the helpless victim, and cast him as the aggressor. And now, with no witnesses around, there would be no one to support his account. Yet, something deep within him wouldn't allow him to let this slide. He was exhausted from always backing down, weary of people like Karen believing they could act with impunity. Michael rested against the side of his car, his eyes fixed on the scratches as his thoughts raced. He knew he couldn't simply let this go. He wouldn't allow it. 15 minutes slipped by as he stood there, waiting and mulling over his next steps. And then, almost on cue, a burst of laughter reached his ears. He looked up and spotted her. Karen stood several cars away, leaning casually against her SUV with a smug, self-satisfied grin. She had been watching him all along. "Oh, poor you," she sneered, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Looks like someone did a number on your precious little car. Maybe next time you won't steal someone else's parking spot, huh?" Michael fixed his gaze on her, his anger simmering just below the surface. He straightened his posture, his eyes locking onto hers. "You think this is funny?" Karen let out another laugh, this one louder and more mocking. "Oh, I think it's absolutely hilarious. There's nothing you can do about it." "What are you gonna do, call the cops?" "Yeah, good luck with that. They'll just arrest you and believe me instead. You people never seem to learn." Her words felt like gasoline being poured onto a fire. Michael could feel his blood boiling under his skin. He wasn't usually one to lash out, but the urge to say something, anything to erase that smug expression, was almost overpowering. He took a step toward her, but before he could say a word, she smirked and taunted. "Go ahead. Say something. I dare you." Michael realized he would have to pick his next words carefully. He knew precisely what he could say to pierce her arrogance and take her down a peg. But as the words began forming in his mind, he questioned how much worse things might become if he gave her the reaction she wanted. And then she did something completely unexpected. She climbed into her SUV, shooting him a grin through the open window. For a brief moment, he thought she might simply drive away. But instead, without any warning, she threw the car into reverse and backed directly into his vehicle, the crunch of metal on metal echoing loudly through the lot. Michael's eyes went wide with shock as her SUV's rear end collided with his front bumper. Karen glanced back at him, laughing triumphantly before speeding away, leaving Michael rooted in disbelief as the undeniable damage stared back at him. This was far beyond just a slap in the face now. This had escalated into an outright war. Michael's hand trembled as he reached for his phone. It was finally time to call the police. Michael's hand shook as he dialed the number, his breathing quick and shallow from the shock of everything that had just transpired. The sound of Karen's SUV colliding with his car echoed relentlessly in his thoughts. His chest constricted with frustration as the weight of her words, actions, and everything she stood for pressed heavily on him. He had tried to keep his composure, had tried to walk away, but she simply wouldn't stop. The phone rang, and when the operator answered, Michael kept his tone even, though the anger beneath the surface threatened to break through. "I'd like to report an incident," he said, pausing momentarily to steady his voice. A woman just intentionally rammed my car and then drove away. I'm following her vehicle right now." The operator requested details, and Michael swiftly provided the description of Karen's SUV, including its make, model, and their current location. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the lingering tension from the confrontation coursing through him as he maintained a safe distance behind her vehicle. Provoking her further was the last thing he wanted, but he wasn't about to let her actions go unanswered. He kept his gaze fixed on her SUV as it navigated through the quiet residential streets. His thoughts raced uncontrollably. What if she had been right about one thing? What if the police chose not to believe him? He had witnessed such situations play out unfairly before, but this time felt distinctly different. There was far too much at stake now. She had pushed things far beyond mere words or trivial insults. At this point, it was about much more than just his pride. It had become a matter of justice. A few tense minutes slipped by before Michael spotted the flashing lights of a police cruiser up ahead. His heart thundered as he saw Karen's SUV begin to slow. The police had intercepted her vehicle right at a red light. He exhaled deeply in relief, reassured that he wasn't dealing with this alone anymore. Karen's SUV veered to the side of the road, and Michael parked a short distance away, taking a moment in his car to collect himself. His hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline coursing through him, but turning back was no longer an option. He had made the call, and now the police were here. As the officers exited their vehicle, Michael's eyes remained on Karen sitting in her driver's seat. At first, she remained still, but then she began gesticulating wildly, shouting something toward the officers. Her frantic movements made it evident that she was deeply agitated. Even muffled by the distance, her voice was unmistakably hers. She had already started crafting herself as the victim in this unfolding scene. Michael inhaled deeply before stepping out of his car, walking deliberately toward the unfolding scene. The officers were already stationed by her window, speaking to her as she gestured wildly in his direction, her face red with fury. "He hit me!" she screamed, her voice carrying clearly to him as he approached. "He attacked me and now he's following me. Arrest him! I'm the one being harassed here." Michael's stomach twisted in knots, and here it was. She was doing exactly what he had dreaded, twisting the narrative to position herself as the victim. But this time, there were witnesses, and he had no intention of backing down. One of the officers, a man named Officer Reynolds, turned his attention toward Michael as he neared. His face was calm and unreadable, and Michael could only hope they would give the truth a fair hearing. "What happened here, sir?" Officer Reynolds asked, his tone measured and professional. Michael drew another deep breath, his heart pounding relentlessly in his chest. "I was in a parking lot," he started, keeping his voice steady. "This woman started yelling at me about a parking spot. Things escalated. She shoved me, slapped me, and then keyed my car while I was inside the store. I tried walking away, but she wouldn't let it go. And just now she backed into my car on purpose and drove off." Karen interrupted, her voice sharp and panicked. "Lies! He's lying! He attacked me! He's dangerous!" Michael's fists tightened, but he kept his tone calm and composed. "There are scratches on my car, officer. You can see the damage for yourself. And she literally just rear-ended my car." Officer Reynolds turned his attention to Michael's car, his eyes narrowing as he examined the damage. "We'll take a look," he said, redirecting his gaze to Karen. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Karen's face flushed deep red as she pounded her fists against the steering wheel. "You can't be serious. You're really going to believe him over me? Look at me. I'm the one who's been attacked. I demand that you arrest him immediately." "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Officer Reynolds repeated, his tone firmer this time. Karen's eyes darted to Michael, her expression a volatile mix of anger and disbelief. "You're doing this because of him, aren't you?" She spat the words, her glare fixed on Michael. "This is all his fault. You people are all the same." Michael bit down on the inside of his cheek, forcing himself to remain composed. This was her tactic: push him, provoke him, and manipulate the situation to paint him as the aggressor. but he refused to give her that satisfaction. At last, Karen opened her door and climbed out, her voice still raised as she yelled at the officers. "This is ridiculous. I'm not the criminal here. He's the one who should be in handcuffs." The officers stayed composed, guiding her to the side as they began asking her additional questions about the incident. Karen persisted in her tirade, pointing aggressively at Michael and loudly proclaiming that he had attacked her and that she was the true victim. As Michael stood quietly, he could feel the immense weight of the situation bearing down on him. The words, the accusations, they hung heavily in the air. It was a scenario all too familiar to him. But this time, he wasn't standing alone in this fight. He wasn't the only one who understood the truth of what had happened. Another officer approached Michael, requesting that he explain the events in greater detail. He recounted the incident with precision, detailing every escalation, each insult she hurled, and the moment Karen intentionally rear-ended his car. "Do you have any witnesses to the initial confrontation?" the officer asked him. Michael shook his head slowly. "There were people in the parking lot, but no one stepped in to help. I'm not sure if anyone happened to record it." The officer gave a small nod. "We'll check the store's surveillance cameras to see if there's any footage from the parking lot. As for the damage to your car, that part is clear enough." Just then, Karen's voice rang out once more. "He's making this all up. You can't seriously believe him over me. He's lying." Michael stiffened as Officer Reynolds returned, his expression grave but controlled. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Karen, "we now have sufficient evidence to place you under arrest for property damage and assault. You'll need to come with us." Karen's face flushed a deeper shade of crimson, and her entire body seemed to tremble with fury. "Arrest me? Are you out of your mind?" She jabbed a trembling finger in Michael's direction. "He's the one who should be in handcuffs, not me. It was me who got attacked." "Ma'am, please turn around," Officer Reynolds repeated as he stepped closer. Before he could complete his sentence, Karen let out a piercing scream and lunged directly at Michael. Her fists struck Michael's shoulder forcefully, taking him by surprise. The blow wasn't severe, but the shock of being attacked right in front of the officers left him momentarily stunned. "You think you can ruin me?" Karen screeched, taking another swing. Her knuckles brushed against Michael's chest, and her seething rage was unmistakable. Her face contorted into something wild and grotesque. The officers acted swiftly, grabbing her arms before she could land another strike. But Karen was uncontrollable, thrashing in their grip as a torrent of venomous words poured out of her mouth. "You're nothing. Do you hear me? You're absolutely nothing. You don't belong here at all." Michael took a step back, his pulse thundering in his ears as he watched the officers wrestle with Karen. Karen flailed and kicked wildly, her incoherent screams echoing as they managed to secure her in handcuffs. "I'm the victim here!" she screamed, her voice breaking as the officers escorted her to the squad car. "You're all going to regret this. I'll have all of your jobs. You can't do this to me." Officer Reynolds maintained a firm grip on her arms, his voice steady but authoritative. "Ma'am, you're officially under arrest for assault and property damage. We're done here." Karen's voice, now hoarse and strained, continued to pierce the air as they secured her in the back of the squad car. Her eyes met Michael's one final time, brimming with raw, unfiltered hatred. "You haven't won," she shouted through the window, her voice muffled yet filled with venom. "You'll see. I'll ruin you. Do you hear me?" The door slammed shut, silencing her tirade as the squad car drove off, leaving Michael standing still, breathless and shaken. Officer Reynolds approached Michael again, his expression easing slightly. "Are you all right, sir?" Michael nodded faintly, still trying to process everything that had just occurred. His shoulder ached from where Karen had struck him, but it wasn't the physical pain that lingered in his mind. It was the outright absurdity of the situation, the way Karen's rage had blinded her to the point that she attacked him in front of law enforcement. "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice carried the weight of strain. "Thank you. We'll have your statement on file," Officer Reynolds assured him, handing over a business card. You're welcome to follow up at the station tomorrow if you decide to press formal charges." "I will," Michael responded, still bearing the heavy emotions of the ordeal. The officers departed, and as the fading sirens disappeared into the distance, Michael found himself standing alone next to his damaged vehicle. He gazed at the scratches and dents, the tangible evidence of Karen's unrelenting fury. It was no longer just about the damage to the car, nor was it simply about the slap or the verbal assaults. This was something far deeper. It was about taking a stand, about ensuring people like Karen wouldn't believe they could act this way without consequences. He hadn't initiated this conflict, but he was determined to see it through to the end. The following morning, Michael entered the police station, the previous day's events lingering vividly in his thoughts. The tightness in his chest lingered, though the subdued hum of the station offered an unexpected sense of calm. He had come here with a single purpose: to officially press charges against Karen. He made his way to the front desk where a young officer looked up from her computer as he approached. "Good morning. How can I assist you?" she asked, her tone professional yet warm. "I'm here to press charges for something that happened yesterday," Michael explained, the gravity of the situation weighing on him. There was an incident involving assault and property damage. Michael stood up, extending his hand to shake Officer Reynolds's firmly. "Thank you. I really appreciate all that you've done." "Just doing my job," Reynolds replied with a faint smile. "Best of luck with everything. We'll be in contact." As Michael exited the station and stepped into the crisp morning air, a peculiar blend of relief and determination settled over him. He had done what was needed, filed the charges, and stood firm in his resolve. But this was far from over. There was still a trial ahead, a courtroom battle to face, and no telling how far Karen would go to try and make good on her threats. Yet Michael had no intention of backing down. He had gotten this far, and now he was determined to see it through to its conclusion. Weeks went by, but at last, the day arrived. Michael sat silently in the courtroom, his heart calm, but his thoughts a whirlwind. The tension was palpable, a subtle hum of anticipation permeating the room. He surveyed the room, noting the rows of benches, the elevated judge's seat, and a few scattered onlookers seated throughout. Up front, the prosecution team prepared their case while Karen sat at the defense table, her face pale but her jaw set in firm defiance. She hadn't uttered a word to him since that day at the station, but the memory of her screaming and lunging at him remained vivid. Her eyes had burned with fury then, but now she sat expressionless, refusing to meet his gaze, as if everything that had unfolded was somehow his doing. Michael inhaled deeply, centering himself on the facts at hand. This wasn't a matter of emotions anymore. It wasn't about the insults, the slap, or even the damage done to his car. This was about responsibility and accountability. Karen had physically attacked him, vandalized his property, and attempted to twist the situation to her benefit. But now, everything was out in the open for everyone to witness. The creak of the door opening drew Michael's focus as the judge entered the courtroom. "All rise." The bailiff's command prompted everyone to rise as Judge Patricia Simmons assumed her position. She was a woman of resolute demeanor, exuding an aura of authority that commanded the room. She was renowned for her impartiality, no-nonsense style, and intolerance for excuses, according to what Michael had read about her. "Be seated," Judge Simmons instructed, and the room sank into a tense quiet as everyone returned to their seats. The proceedings commenced with the attorneys delivering their opening statements. The prosecution outlined the charges against Karen: assault, property damage, and disorderly conduct. Michael listened intently as the prosecutor, a sharp and composed young woman named Ms. Hayes, methodically recounted Karen's actions. Every word was deliberate, professional, slicing through the emotional gravity of the case to present the facts clearly. Mr. Jennings was merely attempting to go about his day, Ms. Hayes began, addressing the jury directly. He did nothing to provoke the attack that followed. Ms. Thompson, however, made the choice to escalate the conflict. Not only did she damage Mr. Jennings's property, but she also assaulted him, twice, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses and even in the presence of law enforcement. We are here today because Ms. Thompson needs to be held responsible for her actions. Karen's attorney, a man with graying hair and a calm, measured tone, rose next to deliver the defense's opening remarks. Ms. Thompson deeply regrets what took place that day, he began. He said, casting a quick glance in her direction. She acted out of frustration, but she is far from the criminal this case is attempting to portray her as. She's a mother, a contributing member of this community, who experienced a particularly difficult day, one that unfortunately spiraled out of control. We asked the jury to take into account the context of the events, the pressures she was facing, and to show compassion in recognizing that this was an isolated occurrence. Michael clenched his jaw, biting the inside of his cheek. Compassion. It was always the same refrain when people like Karen crossed the line. It was always about extending compassion, emphasizing the burdens they were supposedly carrying. Yet, when it came to people like him, the story changed. Empathy replaced by scrutiny, compassion overshadowed by judgment. The trial progressed with the presentation of witness testimonies. Several witnesses who had been present in the parking lot were called to testify. They recounted the confrontation between Michael and Karen, the way the tension escalated, and how Karen had initiated physical aggression. Their testimonies corroborated Michael's version of events, reinforcing the details already recorded in the police reports. But then it was Karen's turn to take the stand. She made her way to the witness box with deliberate steps, her chin raised but her face still marked by stubborn defiance. Taking her seat, she adjusted herself and clasped her hands tightly, waiting as her attorney began his questioning. "Ms. Thompson," her lawyer began in a soft tone, "can you describe the events of the day in question?" Karen released a small sigh before responding. "I was having an awful day," she started, her voice quiet, almost plaintive. "I went to the store, and when I saw that parking spot, I thought it was finally a small reprieve. But then, Mr. Jennings just drove right into it. I got out of my car to confront him, and I regret what happened after that." "Why do you regret it?" her lawyer inquired. "I regret losing my temper," she said, her voice trembling faintly, as though trying to sound remorseful. "But what people don't seem to realize is that Mr. Jennings slapped me as well. I wasn't the only one who escalated the situation. I was hit right back there by him. It was the turn of events Michael had been anticipating, with Karen attempting to portray herself as the victim once more, as if his response somehow matched the violence she had started." Her lawyer nodded sympathetically, casting a glance toward the jury. "Ms. Thompson admits her errors, but it's important to acknowledge that Mr. Jennings also responded with physical action. This was not an entirely one-sided altercation." The courtroom briefly filled with quiet murmurs of conversation. Karen's attorney returned to his seat, and the prosecution prepared for their cross-examination. Ms. Hayes acted quickly, standing from her seat and moving toward Karen with a clear, focused demeanor. "Ms. Thompson," Ms. Hayes began, "you've claimed that Mr. Jennings slapped you, but isn't it true that he only reacted after you slapped him first?" Karen shifted uneasily in her chair, her earlier confidence beginning to waver. "Yes, but he still hit me," she insisted, clinging to her narrative. "And isn't it also true," Ms. Hayes pressed on, "that Mr. Jennings's slap wasn't aggressive or premeditated, but rather a reflex to your own physical assault?" Karen hesitated, her gaze darting toward her attorney as if searching for a lifeline. "Answer the question, Ms. Thompson," Ms. Hayes said firmly. Karen's voice lowered as she admitted, "I suppose it was a reaction, yes." Ms. Hayes nodded slightly, maintaining her firm and composed expression. "So you're admitting that Mr. Jennings did not initiate the physical violence. He merely reacted to being attacked by you?" Before Karen could formulate a response, Ms. Hayes shifted her focus to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness to provide clarity on the nature of the slap that Ms. Thompson has described." Moments later, A middle-aged man who had been present in the parking lot and witnessed the entire incident stepped up to the stand. "Please state your name for the court," Ms. Hayes requested. "Jeffrey Caldwell," the man responded, briefly glancing at the jury before focusing on Ms. Hayes. "Mr. Caldwell, you were present in the parking lot on the day of the incident involving Mr. Jennings and Ms. Thompson, correct?" Ms. Hayes inquired. "Yes, I witnessed the entire thing," he replied confidently. "Could you describe what you observed during the physical confrontation?" Jeffrey nodded. "Well, I saw Ms. Thompson walk up to Mr. Jennings and she was yelling quite loudly at him. I couldn't catch every word from where I was, but it was obvious she was angry. Then she pushed him, and when he didn't respond, she slapped him across the face, hard. That's when Mr. Jennings reacted by slapping her back. But it was different. His reaction wasn't aggressive. It seemed more like he was trying to prevent her from striking him again." Ms. Hayes leaned in just a bit. "Would you say that Mr. Jennings's slap was a reflexive response rather than an effort to escalate things further?" "Absolutely," Jeffrey answered firmly. "It was mild. He didn't appear to want to harm her. It was more of a reflex, like he was trying to defend himself." "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," Ms. Hayes said, shifting her attention back to the jury. "What Mr. Caldwell, a neutral witness, has confirmed is that Mr. Jennings's action was not an act of aggression, but a defensive reaction to Ms. Thompson's assault." Karen's attorney shifted awkwardly in his chair as Ms. Hayes returned to her position. The jury sat quietly, processing all the information they had heard. The courtroom filled with a soft murmur as the judge called for a brief recess before the closing statements. Michael rose to his feet, stretching his legs and feeling a blend of anticipation and nervousness. It was nearing the end. Soon, the jury would determine whether Karen would truly be held accountable for her actions. As court resumed, both the prosecution and defense presented their closing arguments. Ms. Hayes was incisive and clear, ensuring there was no room for uncertainty in the jury's minds. Karen's attorney, by contrast, made another emotional plea, urging the jury to think about the personal context of Karen's behavior. But Michael fully understood what was on the line. This wasn't about someone's rough day or a so-called personal side. This was about fairness and accountability. Hours later, the jury came back to deliver their verdict. The courtroom was still as the foreperson stood up to read the decision aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen Thompson, guilty of assault and property damage." Karen's face lost all color, her composure finally breaking under the weight of the decision. She sat frozen, her hands trembling faintly in her lap. The full weight of her actions had finally come crashing down on her. Michael let out a long breath, a wave of relief washing over him. It wasn't solely about the verdict. It represented something much larger, about standing his ground and defending himself, about proving that no matter how many people like Karen tried to belittle him, he wouldn't be silenced. As the judge adjourned the court, Michael stood tall, his head held high, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Justice had finally been served. The courtroom hummed with murmurs and the sound of people gathering their belongings. Michael stood quietly, letting the significance of the verdict sink in. Karen had officially been found guilty. The burden that had weighed on him ever since she first laid her hands on him in that parking lot began to ease. Yet, even as the relief flowed through him, another feeling lingered. Something quieter, more unsettling beneath the surface. Yes, justice had been served, but the entire ordeal left a bitter taste in his mouth. It wasn't only about winning the case. It was about everything Karen symbolized. Her blatant hatred, her unearned sense of entitlement, her conviction that she could treat him as less than human simply because of his skin color. That wasn't something a legal verdict alone could fix. And that realization hurt far more than the physical sting of her slap in the parking lot. As Michael exited the courthouse, the cool breeze brushed against his face. He stopped on the courthouse steps, inhaling the crisp air, though it did little to lighten the heaviness in his chest. The verdict had resolved the legal matter, but emotionally he felt anything but settled. Why did people like Karen have to exist? He couldn't let go of the anger simmering just below the surface. The entire ordeal, the yelling, The slap, the mocking, and the attack. It had all been born from Karen's deeply rooted racism. She hadn't seen him as a fellow human being, but as someone she could demean and mistreat solely because of his race. And that kind of hatred was far from rare. It was present everywhere, in the daily interactions often too subtle to call out, but equally hurtful. He despised how people like Karen moved through life with such ease, spreading their venom without hesitation. Her behavior during the trial, portraying herself as a victim while dismissing the harm she had done, made him feel sick. But beyond that, it served as a reminder of how deeply ingrained this kind of racism still is. He had grown up surrounded by these stories, hearing his parents, uncles, and friends recount times when they had been dehumanized. He had faced it himself many times before. The quiet jabs, the sporadic slurs. But this was something altogether different. Karen had physically assaulted him and done so with such bold confidence, as though she was certain she'd face no consequences. Michael's fists tightened at the thought, the sting of her slap still burning, not just on his skin, but on his sense of dignity. He had attempted to walk away, to de-escalate the confrontation, but she had only pushed it further. It was individuals like Karen who made the simple act of existing as a black man in America feel so exhausting. No matter how composed, courteous, or professional you were, there was always someone waiting to diminish you simply because they could. Ms. Hayes, the prosecutor, walked over, drawing him out of his thoughts. She offered him a small, understanding smile. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her tone remaining professional but laced with kindness. Michael gave a small shrug. "I suppose I feel relieved, but not as triumphant as I expected," he admitted. Ms. Hayes gave a thoughtful nod. "That's completely understandable. Legal victories in cases like this often come with a bittersweet aftertaste. It's about more than just winning the verdict, isn't it?" Michael gave a slow nod. "Yeah. The thing is, people like her, they don't just disappear. Even after all this, Karen probably still thinks she didn't do anything wrong. And there are countless others out there just like her. It's annoying." His voice trembled slightly, the bottled-up frustration spilling over. Ms. Hayes looked at him with a sympathetic expression. "I understand. Unfortunately, people like her aren't uncommon and the system has its limits. But what you did today is significant. Standing up for yourself always matters." "I am aware," Michael mumbled. But the weight of it felt more like an ongoing struggle than a win, one he hadn't requested. "I simply detest the fact that it still occurs, and that individuals like me must continue to struggle for something as fundamental as respect. I'm over it." Ms. Hayes gave another nod, her face softening. "Michael, you're correct to feel exhausted. It's draining. However, it makes a difference each time someone like you takes a position and resists, even if it doesn't feel that way at first." Michael forced a faint, weary smile. "Thank you for everything you did in court. I truly appreciate it." "You're welcome," she said warmly. "Take care of yourself, all right? And if you ever need assistance, don't hesitate to contact me." With that, she gave him a courteous nod and departed, leaving Michael standing alone on the courthouse steps. He inhaled deeply and started toward his car. The same car that had been at the center of the entire ordeal in the parking lot. The car's damage had been fixed, but every time he saw it, memories of that day resurfaced. The scratches, the dents, they were etched into his mind. They had served as tangible reminders of the ugliness of Karen's behavior. Even though the car appeared as good as new, the memory still clung to him. As he settled into the driver's seat, he paused for a moment of silence. His reflection in the rearview mirror drew his gaze, and he studied his own face. He truly looked at himself. The man staring back in the mirror appeared drained, exhausted from constantly having to fight to be treated as an equal, tired of being perceived as a threat or a target solely because of his skin color. This wasn't just about Karen. She was merely a piece of a much larger problem. Racism wasn't some isolated, uncommon occurrence. It was interwoven into the fabric of everyday life. It manifested in subtle moments, like when people hesitated to sit next to him on the train or when cashiers seemed overly cautious whenever he paid in cash. And then it revealed itself in blatant, violent acts, like Karen slapping him in the parking lot, believing she'd face no repercussions. Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. It wasn't fair at all. None of it was fair. Yet this was the reality he had to navigate daily. People like Karen weren't disappearing, and the weight of that truth bore down on him like a crushing burden. He despised that this was the reality he had to endure. He loathed the fact that his skin color marked him as a target for people like Karen. Above all, he hated having to repeatedly explain why this behavior was wrong. He started the car, exhaled deeply, and drove out of the parking lot. The city streets blurred past him as his mind wrestled with frustration. The trial had concluded, but the deeper battle, the fight against the entrenched racism people like Karen harbored, was far from over. As he drove, a pang of sadness crept into his chest. He had achieved a win today, yet it didn't feel like a triumph. It felt more like he had endured yet another confrontation in an endless chain of struggles, and he was certain there would be more to come. People like Karen didn't simply vanish after a guilty verdict. They persisted, time and time again. Michael parked in his driveway, his body heavy with exhaustion and his mind burdened by it all. As he switched off the engine and sat in the stillness, her words echoed in his mind. That standing up for himself truly mattered. Perhaps it did. Maybe it was the sole way to resist the relentless tide of individuals who shared Karen's mindset. But at that moment, all Michael longed for was peace. To live without the need to constantly fight, to no longer feel the need to justify his very existence, to simply exist. As he stepped out of the car and headed toward his front door, he tried to center himself on the small comfort of knowing Karen had faced some accountability. Yet the bitterness lingered, and he realized it would be a long time before his anger at the world he navigated would begin to subside. For now, he had done what was within his power, and that would have to suffice.